In 2014, Riot Games published an article titled Exploring Runeterra, the fictional setting of the immensely popular MOBA game League of Legends. It detailed a number of changes that they were making to the setting moving forward, explaining that attempting to tie gameplay and narrative together was creating constraints that were beginning to become suffocating. But in order to move ahead with these changes, Riot first had to look back. The retcon, retroactive continuity, had gone a ways to removing many characters, or champions as they're called in League, out of the game's world. Before any more could be done to advance their plots, they needed to be given a new place within Runeterra, and that meant more retcons. What began as a process of fixing champions who were uprooted by this change became one of updating nearly every champion they felt no longer met their standards. Among these characters was the archer Varus, whose update went live in November of 2017, and to many it was just another update, albeit one with particular flair. But to anyone familiar with the character, the update did something else. These days, Riot uses a short biography format to introduce new players to their characters' backstories, or lore, expanding on key aspects in later material. None of the sort existed for Varus prior to the update, and so I wrote the following myself. Once the proud warden of an Ionian temple and the evil power within, when Noxian armies invaded, Varus was forced to choose between the temple he was sworn to protect and his own nearby village, defenseless without him. Gravely, he chose to stay and keep the evil corruption from those who might unleash its power. Yet remorse at the sight of his slain family gave way to seething hatred. Swearing vengeance, Varus released the power he had given everything to keep contained, so it may give him the strength to carry out his retribution before being consumed. That was the basic pitch for the character, but he also released with a short reveal comic from a collaboration with Penny Arcade, an Ask Me Anything from the creative designer Riot Scribbles, and was the last champion to receive a League judgment, a short story that described the champion and their motivations before the retcon wiped most from canon, the official story. I bring this up because it's a common sentiment that characters released in this era were critically lacking in story. And while that does happen to be true, it isn't as true as most believe it is. Much of the story occupies a strange space between published material and potential for development. There was often a very real process of authors interfacing with the community about where they wanted to take their stories, and with this context, it's possible to observe the allusions to that potential in what little material was published. If we only view the story as published material, however, then we're writing off these plotlines as fanfiction by the authors about their own stories. In Varus's case, the context provided by Scribbles makes it clear that his story is not an explanation of revenge and angst, it's an exploration of grief and trauma. Which begs the question, what's the difference? What separates a good revenge story from a bad one? Or to put it in other terms, what does a revenge story need to be in order to make it worth telling? So I'll get this out of the way. Yeah, Varus' story featured a fridged wife and child. The degree to which this may matter to you will vary. To some it's meaningless, and to others it's cause to dismiss a story entirely. I'm not here to pass judgment either way. If you happen not to like revenge plots, okay. If you do, also okay. For better or worse, violent spectacle is fun, but we can't deny that gaming is filled with some of storytelling's most egregious examples. You have a right to be skeptical because the trope is routinely used to amplify the badass factor of their characters with no regard given to additional implications. As with all tropes, there are good and bad executions, and as with all popular tropes, the bad executions outnumber the good. And so the criticism went that Varus' story was just another generic revenge plot that used a dead family to justify and glorify his violence. I'm not saying that his story didn't indulge in power fantasy. It's a necessary step to selling the character, but what separates him from Lucian, Misfortune, and Vayne, among other tropey characters of League's cast, is that there's rarely a moment of contemplation or introspection as these other characters enact their crusade. We're meant to cheer as they overcome evil demons or pirates or whatever have you. The emphasis on Varus' character isn't this unrelenting whirlwind of revenge. In fact, Varus' vendetta is framed as a failure, an act of self-destruction. The emphasis is on his solemn reflection of his choices, whether he'll attempt to find his peace or throw away what little he has left. He has more in common with characters like Teka from Moana, or even the Babadook, which are both highly regarded for how they characterize trauma. In Riot Scribbles' words, When the very things that served as a foundation of his loyalty were taken away, he lost sight of why he ever cared in the first place. Now the only thing he has left is to try to make up for what he didn't do when he had the chance. Varus' story wasn't about revenge. Varus' story was about the consuming, seductive power of hatred. Varus' story was about grief. Okay, so that's a lofty claim to make, but maybe you're still not convinced. Either that the character was about grief or that the character was good at all. I don't know if I can change your mind if you've already made it up, but as a self-indulgence, I did want to create something of an ode to the character and everyone who worked on him, and I think I'd like to start with most people's first encounter with this character, the splash art. It remained one of the best visualizations of a champion right up until it was replaced. The haze-like flames bleed into and obscure the composition, driving the blinding hatred metaphor home before you even read a word of his story. The drawn bow creates a strikingly powerful line of action, encapsulating his defining quote, "The life of an arrow is fleeting, built of nothing but direction and intent." Whether a deliberate choice or not, the lack of crisp detail in the splash also manages to effectively represent the behavior of the corruption. When asked about his bow, Scribbles discussed conceptualizing it as a manifestation of the corruption that serves Varus' will, which is to say that if Varus had been a spear-wielding warrior, the corruption would change itself to suit him. Where his hand ends and the bow begins could be somewhat in question, as portrayed in the following scene. He absorbs his bow, lest he be tempted to use it in the Institute of War. It slithers into his palm to rest. In-game, it ripples and flows like a sentient ooze. Writhing tendrils reach out to grasp opponents, orbs of liquid blight hover around debuffed players, and when it comes to violence as spectacle, I don't think any piece of writing for any League of Legends champion compares to the following line. Though what it fired wasn't an arrow, it behaved as one, it ruined as one. Traveled through the Noxian insignia out of one gasping soldier and into another, exploding with 6 thirsting tongues that gripped and snared. The physicality of the corruption is an incredibly small detail to get hung up over, but it's also an incredibly consistent detail. In fact, there's a staggering amount of characterization given to the corruption taking hold of Varus. The community had taken to calling it Palace, and the mystery surrounding its true nature was a consistently entrancing plot point. It played into the idea that the Ionian elders who had appointed Varus the temple's warden are not all-knowing or even necessarily trustworthy. Being unaware of or even deliberately hiding the true nature of things from their people, inadvertently creating antagonists like Zed and Syndra. Additionally, through Palace, critical passages in the Judgment provide yet more evidence for the story's true themes. It knew people. It could taste them on the air. It knew that they had a hive at the base of its hill where they writhed in their nonsense bodies. Varus could sense its confusion, and something like being hurt. The isolation of the temple had accrued in it. It wanted to show him something he would like. It wanted to make something for him. Its urge was to please. This was not the implacable beast he had been sworn to contain. I'll read that again if you missed it. Varus could sense its confusion and something like being hurt. Palace is the personification of the hatred and malevolence consuming Varus, and at its core is hurt. The allegory here is not subtle, but still perhaps too subtle, because the new iteration of Palace, Varus, is not a personification of anything. I think it's time now to talk about how the story was rewritten, and the biography summary he released with is as good a place to start as any. One of the ancient race of Darkin, Varus was a deadly killer who loved to torment his foes with arrows, driving them to insanity before closing for the kill. Possessed of wondrous beauty, Varus was imprisoned at the end of the Darkin War, but escaped, centuries later, in the remade flesh of 2 Ionian hunters. The 2 men had unwittingly released Varus and now bear the bow containing his bound essence. Varus now hunts those who trapped him in order to enact his brutal vengeance, but the souls bound within him fight him every step of the way. If this story sounds like a completely different thing, it's because it is, and it only becomes more detached once you begin examining it in depth. Varus' new story pits him as an evil creature called a Darkin, trapped within a bow at the bottom of a well in the Ionian village Palace. When Noxian forces invade, the 2 hunters, Valmar and Kai, rush to Palace's defense, but Kai, Valmar's lover, is wounded and Valmar brings him to the well. As they both enter, Varus escapes and reforms their flesh into a body that contains the consciousness of all 3. The central tension then becomes whether the Darkin can seize control of their body by stoking Valmar's hatred of the Noxians, or Kai and Valmar can through their love. The story was told primarily in 4 parts: a comic, a music video, another comic, and a short story. I first must commend Riot's narrative team for the multiple medium storytelling. I think it's a great experiment, but my praise largely ends there. The story has trouble establishing the personalities of the 2 main characters, not helped by the fact that they even look alike. It ends up much easier to view Valmar and Kai as a single character, with their most standout traits being their love for one another. Over the course of their story, Valmar and Kai also fail to express agency. Things happen to them, not because of them. The lack of any strong choices reduces the importance of their individual characteristics, making them less discernible from one another, but it's also a problem in its own right. Immediately before the invasion, Valmar is given a warning by an oracle, telling him to abandon Kai. It's intended to posit a tension between duty and passion when Kai is struck by an arrow. However, neither the choice nor its consequences are ever presented clearly to either Valmar or the audience, meaning when he brings Kai to the well, we don't learn anything about him. In fact, at the most pivotal moment for this character, it's unclear whether or not releasing Varus is a choice at all. Varus' new, detailed biography describes the bow containing him being trapped in the well, remaining hidden for centuries, unknown, untouched, and all but forgotten. But this is contradicted by the village, temple, and order of wardens that's built very deliberately around it. Valmar's mother is even unfazed by the appearance of the Darkin, commenting matter-of-factly that he released it. The very next lines say that Valmar brings Kai to the well, believing the well's forbidden magic could restore him. One of the writers, Riot Daicool, describes Varus' release as a deal with the devil, but the music video constructs a scene where the Darkin is acting upon the characters against their will. The comic makes Valmar seem like he's being drawn or called there by a force beyond his control, and the final panel of the first comic shows the pair leaping into the pit together. The opening of the music video, however, shows Valmar bringing Kai to the well, but then desperately swimming after him. The biography describes Valmar as having unwittingly released Varus, and what I'm trying to get at is that the role the well plays in the world is unclear due to many inconsistent details. Thus, it's even more difficult to understand what motivates Val to bring Kai to the well when the latter is injured. Either he does so believing that the waters are benevolent and will heal him, but is wrong about the temple's nature and realizes too late, or he believes that there's a forbidden power that will heal Kai, but with terrible consequences that he chooses to ignore. Or something else entirely. Another problem that arises is that Valmar is a different character in either scenario. Luckily, or unluckily, both versions contain flaws of characterization. The Valmar that accidentally releases Varus doesn't make any choice at all. There's no tension, just a sequence of events. The Valmar that knows the well contains a forbidden power that will heal Kai and is willing to make a deal with the devil is by far the stronger character, but he still only knows vaguely that the power is forbidden and something bad might happen. As much as he makes a choice, he doesn't make it knowing the consequences, which are themselves fairly insignificant. Okay, I'll level. It would be pretty traumatizing to have your body ripped apart and put back together with an evil demon and your lover inside of it, but within the confines of this story, Valmar sets out to save Kai, and he succeeds. They're even able to vow that together with their immortality, they'll seek out a way to separate their bodies again. There's no real loss here. This is far from a tragic story and doesn't begin to justify Valmar's drive for vengeance being a convincing motivator or source of tension. After their ordeal, however, we reach our antagonist, Varus. If you were hoping for a compelling villain, Varus is anything but. His personality starts and ends with the joy he expresses at murder. There really isn't much more to say. You can't make Skeletor interesting or sympathetic, no matter how seriously he's taken by the story or himself. In an attempt to deepen the antagonist and appease fans of the old lore, they've tried to merge both versions of Varus by adding references to the old lore into the backstory of the Darkin Varus, but this fails for a number of reasons. Varus, before he loved tormenting his foes to insanity, had a family. During an ancient war, he refused to abandon his post, costing them their lives. Over the next centuries, his anguish would transform him into the sadistic monster Valmar and Kai encounter. On the surface, it almost appears as though it effectively mirrors his old story. Succumbing to hatred turns Varus into a monster. It's true that both versions of Varus choose to stay their post when their family is threatened, and both pay a price for it. Yet as much as it's an incredibly resonant dramatic moment, it isn't actually crucial to the story Varus is telling. If you were to strip it away entirely, the core metaphor for consuming hatred is still intact. It's a characterizing moment, but it's not the story. And yet, it's all that was retained. Ironically, this new version of Varus does play into the worst pitfalls of the dead family trope. The bad guy being evil because his family died is a cliche played painfully straight. By contrast, old Varus's loss isn't the sole drive for his descent into darkness. It's an opportunity for him to make another choice. Without the corruption, there's no believable reason for him not to turn away and seek solace in community, with the others in the world who suffered the same losses. The corruption represents Varus breaking under the weight placed upon him and crossing a line he can't ever return from, at least in his own eyes, because he still carries the sympathies of the audience and likely other characters in the world. Varus doesn't immediately become irredeemably evil once he takes the corruption onto himself. There's still a chance for redemption, and we still don't know for certain that the corruption can't be halted or reversed. Dramatic tension is derived from Varus himself not seeing or not wanting to see this. It's a tension that's absent with the new evil Varus, because most importantly, Varus is an antagonist in someone else's story, Valmar and Kai. The many changes to the setup of the story ensure that it's impossible to tell one with the same themes, let alone the same characters. Varus is not Varus. And nowhere is this more apparent than the replacement splash art. Where the original managed to reinforce the core themes of its character, the new one homogenizes him. His bow is tucked away, rendered an afterthought. The image bizarrely chooses to emphasize a mix of sex appeal and malevolence, likening Varus to, of all the characters, Evelyn. Whether or not it's to your taste, it's not a bad image by any means, but the technical fidelity doesn't offer enough in replacement for the strong composition and character focus of the previous. When comparing the two stories, whatever you think of the old, its main character was an active agent, the stakes were higher, and the consequences more certain. The internal logic was more consistent, supporting the rest of the world building as well, and it was more cohesive across all of its representations in art, gameplay, and story. With no changes to the in-game model or voiceover, the character is now awkwardly caught between differing portrayals. The entire story is. I've made the argument that the new story is, on its own merits, worse than the old. That's entirely subjective, but there's no denying that the new character is an entirely new one with no relation to Varus. The lore update erased Varus. So then, why? Why invalidate all of the work of all of these writers and artists? Why alienate fans of the character? Whether a result of genuine belief that the new story preserved the character or an unwillingness to admit mistakes, plenty of reasons have been put forward. The writers, Riot Daiquil and Riot Dinopause, had in the weeks following the release been fairly active on various forums explaining their process and providing us plenty of material by which to help answer these questions. The most common theme among all of these responses is the desire to provide more and more higher quality content. Despite the failures of the story that ultimately released, there is no denying the sincerity of this statement. No one sets out to make something bad. This desire to improve, however, serves more as an indication of Riot's whole philosophy, rather than to provide any context into this particular case study. It comes up more as a preface to whatever explanation is about to be given. Explanations like the team considering ways that Varus could be more unique. Baked into this statement is the evaluative judgment that Varus' story isn't unique, or that being unique is an intrinsic measure of quality. If we were to pretend for a moment that Varus' story was as cliché as the statement implies, it still doesn't go far enough to explain why he, of all characters, was changed so drastically, especially when many characters have received changes that add these motivations and story devices where they didn't previously exist. Among them, Annie and Zack's parents are now dead. Darius now had a wife who died, Vayne had a mother figure who she killed herself, and Jinx is now a traumatized orphan enacting her politically motivated havoc spree. And that's excluding characters whose original lore states already included these story devices. Thus, for one of the few existing champions whose story truly justified its use of the vengeance trope, uniqueness is a fairly hollow excuse for removal. Especially when juxtaposed against the new power of love story with sadistic evil antagonist. Multiple forces vying for control of the same vessel may not be as played out in storytelling at large, but it certainly has its share of representatives in League of Legends, such as the Dark and Rost, who serves as the crux of another justification. connection to the wider story of League of Legends. It was posited that Varus' story had previously concerned only himself, while the new version offers more opportunity for the character to play a part in an interconnected epic. Hand in hand with this is the assertion that Varus' story was also largely finished and had nowhere left to go. Now, it's objectively true that the new story is more connected, because it's being compared against a story that had no development or modernization since the universe-wide retcon in 2014. And in fact, the new story attributes all of its connective tissue to its Darkin, even in its writer's words. Consider that Aatrox was released in 2013, and since then fans had been speculating that the corruption taking hold of old Varus was itself a Darkin. The original writers had also been careful to keep the corruption an open story concept, leaving the outcome of its consumption ambiguous. If we were to accept this fan theory as canon, then both stories are identical in their ability to relate to the wider League universe. In fact, there's a strong argument that Varus' story offers more connections. I might be in the minority in suggesting that story potential isn't strictly necessary for a character. Sometimes a champion is loved because their quirky, one-dimensional nature can be played for laughs, and sometimes storyless spectacle is perfectly adequate and satisfying content for fans. Not all champions need to play their part in a Game of Thrones scale epic, and considering the infrequency of pure narrative updates, storytelling potential isn't the most satisfying promise a character can make. Since their lore retcon nearly 3 years ago as of the writing of this video, Leona and Diana have gotten next to no story developments at all. With that said, the directions Varus' story could have gone are endless should it have chosen to push him to encounter other characters. Characters who have had similar experiences and contrast or reflect his actions back to him. The corruption's original incarnation only exacerbates this potential, affording its own story opportunities along the darkened plotlines. What if Varus slips too far, and Pallas begins to see the error in the pursuit of vengeance, subverting the human good, dark and evil dynamic that's been established thus far? How would a Darkin sympathetic to humanity react to its malevolent brethren? Varus' story was far from over. It could have gone anywhere you wanted it to. I make this assertion without knowing what Riot intends to do with the new character. It's very likely that they have a specific idea for a story that they wish to tell, one that only this version of the character is capable of fulfilling. But if that's true, then it means that Riot is prioritizing their overarching plot and is willing to erase the characters those plots should be about in the first place. Which brings us back to the desire to be constantly improving, evolving, and delivering content. According to the writers, reactions to old Varus were middling, which means that players never felt strongly about him one way or the other. Which is hardly surprising for a character who has left to stagnate since release. No new character interactions or mentions in other character stories. Varus players consider themselves lucky to see him in the background of a fan comic, let alone a full-blown animation. League of Legends is not a game that puts its focus on storytelling, and it hasn't cultivated a community that does so either. Characters aren't judged for their stories, they're judged for their spectacle, for new skins, animations, and comics. Because Riot is bar none one of the largest video game companies, and they can hire from an enormously skilled talent pool, meaning every piece of visual audio content they produce is exceptional, and that quality gets projected onto the characters involved. Like the comic Blood of Noxus, centered around the character Darius, it creates a female love interest only to kill her off. I wish there were more to the story, but there isn't. Darius is, however, an already popular character, getting a strong showing in 2 animated shorts, and as discussed, the comic is gorgeous. So naturally, fans either overlooked or didn't even notice the tedious story. Whether a character is good or bad, if they're in the spotlight enough, they'll be loved. When you compare the fans of story to the fans of animations and comics, the odds are already stacked against the former. There are over 140 characters in this game. It's simply impossible for a single player to be invested in the stories of each and every one, especially when so much of those stories and their themes are buried behind obscure search queries in antiquated forums. So it makes sense then how most still consistently miss the mark in understanding the themes and motifs of Varus' old story, and likely explains the new writers misunderstanding them too. So I've deliberately made it to this point without bringing up a certain topic, and I do believe that itself is a kind of statement, but just so there's no ambiguity, and because despite my wishes it had become an important piece of the conversation, I think we're going to have to talk about the representation of League's first gay character. And I'm going to start by venting my frustrations towards those who threw around terms like SJW and virtue signaling across the conversation. Accusations of pandering quickly came to dominate the conversation. These were the loudest detractors of the news story, and their voices eroded at the credibility of people who could articulate their anger without resorting to borderline, and in many cases not borderline, homophobia. There are valid criticisms of New Varus. There are valid criticisms of Riot's approach to queer representation, and they're separate conversations. Now, I'd normally be content to say no more about it, but there's a lot wrapped up with Varus that I don't feel right not unpacking. With the current knowledge we have about the culture of Riot and its alienation of LGBT team members, I think it's important to discuss the treatment of these characters in League, starting with Varus. I'll make this caveat. I am, as far as I know, a straight guy. It arguably isn't my place to speak on these topics, and if I've missed anything, I invite any viewers, whether they lie along the queer spectrum or not, to leave a comment letting me know. My ability to understand and speak about this topic comes through intersectionality and my identity as a racial minority. With that said, Valmar and Kai are a homosexual couple, League's first LGBT characters. For a game with such a sized roster, it took them way too long to make this step. But when they did, it was a smashing success. LGBT players of League grew immediately attached as soon as the comic and music video went live. Riot tapped into important experiences and stories for a huge amount of players, and that matters because their experiences matter, and it is a big deal. The music video faced censorship in certain countries, and the knee-jerk response of the bigots in the player base proves that even in the current year, it's still a risk. But make no mistake, it was a calculated risk. Diana and Talia before them had a chance to represent the same communities, but Riot pushed back on their creators' visions. They were new champions, and the potential backlash threatened the fiscal success of their release. Varus had shipped a long time ago, and in his current deprecated state, Riot determined that he was a safe avenue for this development. If the release went poorly, they'd already made their money from him, and the amount of players upset would be minimal. If it went well, however, it reinvigorates interest not just in the character, but in Riot themselves. The music video doesn't function solely as an announcement for a new character, but an invitation for praise. Praise that I myself find Riot undeserving of. Valmar and Kai have no presence in the game, not in his splash art, model, or voice lines. Regardless of what reaction Riot anticipated, Valmar and Kai are tucked neatly out of sight of most players, and the events that befall them throughout their story flirt frustratingly close to a harmful pattern of persecuting gay characters in fiction, a trope commonly referred to as burying your gays. I mentioned previously that the new story doesn't carry an air of loss or tragedy within it, and within the bounds of dramatic narrative tension, that's true. However, when discussing the creative decisions of the authors, the persecution of the gay characters serves the interest of removing them from the audience's eye, and so can be examined through the lens this trope offers to us. Compare the most physically intimate shots in either Blood of Noxus focusing on Darius' struggle with his soldierly duty, and Heartlight focusing on Valmar and Kai's relationship. The complaint here is that even in their own comic, Valmar and Kai's relationship is tucked away and watered down, not that they aren't sexualized to an equal degree. Indeed, Riot seemed to take special care to sexualize both characters who represent their queer player base thus far, Varus and the recently released Nico, whose childlike characteristics add a particularly upsetting element to the character. The equivalency between sexuality and orientation is also one that has a long history of being used to persecute homosexual people. Riot wasn't willing to have Diana or Talia be League's first gay or trans characters respectively. It was only after the expose about their pervasively sexist culture that a newly released champion was allowed to be openly gay. Which I don't say to pass judgment about the team that worked on her, or to suggest that it isn't significant, but to call attention to the dispassionate decision-making that goes into whether or not the community gets one of these characters. I think that League's LGBT community deserves much, much better than Valmar, Kai, and Nico. Two characters cannot and should not represent League's entire queer player base, and when it comes to supporting their community, Riot needs to show they're willing to take a real hit to their bottom line in order to do what's right before I'll voice my approval. Returning to the conversation about the reception to New Varus, whether or not I think the praise Riot received is deserved, there's no denying that it was received. But that praise had nothing to do with the original character Varus. It was about a step for the queer community, and the same step would have been taken if Riot had put the same level of effort into any LGBT character. or confirmed one of the many characters whose positions on that spectrum had been speculated since their release. Fans of Varus' lore were a minority of a minority, and their frustration was being compared against the exaltation of 2 comics, a fully animated music video complete with behind the scenes, and nearly the entire LGBT player base of League of Legends. Within these parameters, Riot could have pushed through any change to any champion, and it would have been positively received. The Varus update delivered nothing to anyone that demanded he be erased. In the Exploring Runeterra developer blog, Riot discussed its failures in storytelling and resolved to find new ways to tell more stories, so that so many characters aren't left to wither for so long. It explicitly stressed the importance of preserving characters and keeping their portrayals consistent. Shortly after the Varus lore update, it had been discussed that a framework of pain versus gain is applied when considering updates like this. The philosophy that a character need be preserved in an update is no longer relevant, almost as if Exploring Runeterra had gone through its own retcon. The new version might simply read that the negative reception of any change must be drowned out by the positive, with the content of that change being insignificant. The new character is at a glance unrelated to the old, and the story should have been repurposed once that became clear. But the update was never about the character or the story he meant to tell. It wasn't about his players. It wasn't about fans of any story in League. It was about whatever Riot wanted the story to be that day. It isn't the worst case of an update removing a character. It's not even the most recent. Varus isn't my character. He's not yours. He's Riot's. This update reaffirmed that, and for me was the impetus to leave the game for good. In the Magic the Gathering community, there's a term applied to players who connect strongly to the story and world. It's called Vorthos. Some of the most popular and enduring content creators fall into this category. They champion the game even in its weakest moments. Their fervor and passion inspires some of the most popular sets, and the story, for all its flaws, continues being told. Not just in the ongoing web-based short stories, but in the game, in new cards printed or new art released. Players can talk over the table and piece together what happened to the characters in their cards. Story is not like a balance patch. You'll never make everyone happy when balancing gameplay, but over time, people will forget about how the game used to look, and if the game is fun enough, they won't care. But people don't forget stories. For many players of League of Legends, Riot has taken away their ability to connect over the story permanently. Not all at once, mind you. There's no single event where all League's Vorthos players quit. Instead, it was through constant changes just like Varus that punished players for getting attached. Because any character, any story, can be thrown out for any reason. League is more than a game. It's an ongoing culture, and try as I might, I can't stop Varus from being remembered by that culture as a character devoid of value. But I have to try. Because as silly as it is, I love this character. And I wish Riot had loved him too. Thanks for watching.
Varus was a character whose kind of arc went pretty linear. You know, this thing happened, that thing happened, now I will avenge the first thing that happened.